Hi there, and welcome. This is the first video and lecture for Integrated Molecular Evolution, and the book of the same name is based on the course. So I wrote the book primarily to cover the areas that I cover in the class. So it's fairly comprehensive in that way. So my name's Scott Rogers. And here's my office number, 411. Of course, we're online this semester, so I won't be in my office too much. There's my lab, 515, Life Sciences. My phone number, you can leave a message there, but it's probably easier to contact me by using my email. My primary PhD is in molecular biology, but I've also worked a lot in molecular evolution. With microbes and nucleic acids in ice from glacial and lake ice. I've also studied introns quite a bit, primarily group 1 introns, and we'll be discussing those later in the course. Also spent a lot of time on nucleic acid preservation, both preservation and extraction of DNA and RNA. And then I've worked quite a bit on ancient microbes and ancient nucleic acids. And my master's degree is in plant development, so I've actually published in that area as well. So I'll be covering many of these topics in this course. Here's a general outline of the course, and you'll find more details in the syllabus, which I've posted as well. So this will be on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The scheduled times for the class, 11:30 to 12:20. We'll primarily be discussing the videos, so that you'll need to watch the videos prior to class. On some Fridays, usually alternate Fridays, we'll also discuss papers, so I'll be handing those out, and you'll need to read those carefully before class. There will be 4 exams, and they are take-home essays. So here are the dates, and you'll have about a week to complete each one. And I'll go into more detail about that at the time we do the exam. But essentially, I'll give you 6 questions. You'll choose 2 of those to answer in detail. The grading down here gives the breakdown for both undergraduate students and graduate students. For the undergraduate students in here, your grade will be determined primarily by the exams, 90%, but also some amount from the discussions, and that's primarily the discussions in class and specifically for paper discussions on those Fridays. For graduate students, because they're required to do a paper, which consists of a research paper or a summary of a research paper or set of papers, then 15% of their grade is on that, and 75% is on the grade, or on the exams, and 10% on the discussions. So over here is the schedule. If you have any problems with particular dates on here when you won't be available or something happens, something like that, let me know in advance so that I can make accommodations for anyone who has problems with any of those dates. Here's the layout of the class a little bit in detail with regard to some of those different activities we'll be doing. So the videos will be posted on Canvas, and so make sure that you view those prior to each of the class times. And I probably will be calling on some people as well in these, so you need to pay attention. The papers and articles, these ones you need to read the paper carefully prior to the discussions. And during these discussions of the papers and articles, I would like you to have your video open as well. I need to see you. We need to see all the people in these discussions, so you will need to turn your cameras on in that case. For the exams, these will be take-home exams. You'll have about 1 week to complete them. All are essay, drawing, explanation, etc. Some people in here have already taken some of my classes, so they know how these work. Approximately 2 weeks before the exam, you'll receive some practice questions, and some of those will be used on the exam. The exam is designed to be a learning exercise, not a teaching exercise. So you need to treat it that way, that you're trying to learn something. If I sense any cheating, plagiarism, copying, that sort of thing, then you'll have a 0 for the entire exam. And I also need to report that to the university as well. For the discussions, of course, you must read each of those assigned papers in detail. So for these papers and articles, make sure that you read those in depth and in detail. Now, you might not understand parts of it, and that's fine, but come with your questions about those things that you don't understand as well. Reading the paper does not mean that you just simply glance over the abstract right before class. That's not going to work. You need to go through the paper in detail all the way through. So here's the layout of the class as well. We'll be starting with general evolution, looking at the big picture and looking from today and looking backwards. And then we'll go into chemical evolution and the RNA world, and then into biological molecules just briefly. If you want to know more about that, I cover those in more depth in some other classes. And then talk specifically about RNA-centric life, and then into evolution of the genetic code, and ribosomes are a big part of that. And then into DNA replication, segregation, genetics, population genetics, mutation, infectious changes, and phylogenetic analysis. And then into more complex systems such as development of multicellular organisms and cancer. And then the last section is on genomes, and I cover these also in some other classes, but I'll cover these in more detail here. Here's the textbook we'll be using in this course. And I wrote this several years ago. Started in about 2010, and then the second edition came out in 2017. This presents concepts and examples, and it's written for comprehension and understanding. So I did have undergraduate students and graduate students read some of the chapters before I published this. The second edition is nearly double the first edition. So if you have a first edition, there's a lot more in the second edition. And the original title was Concepts, Principles, and Nuances, not so informative, so we chose Integrated Molecular Evolution as the final one. It's available from CRC Press directly or from Amazon. I think they have a few copies in the library as well. So what is evolution? And of course, Darwin, when he was writing the first edition of his book, he didn't even use the term evolution. He was interested mainly in natural selection, how these characters are selected by environmental conditions. So he knew nothing about mutation, nothing about genes, nothing about DNA, RNA, none of that, but came up with some of the basic ideas about evolution way back in 1859. Well, between 1830 and 1859. But we now know that evolution consists of three basic parts. One is mutation of the DNA or RNA in a particular cell or virus. And then natural selection, which is selecting for those mutations, either in a positive or negative way. And then random genetic drift. These are mutations that are not selected for or against, but they build up within an organism's genome over time. So the first part of these are mutations, and these are inherited changes in the DNA. So they have to be inherited to be called mutations, going from one generation to the next to the next. And these are always called random, although they're not completely random. So you can say that they're sort of a pseudo-random process of creating these mutations in the genome of an organism. And in the case of most organisms, that's in the DNA, but in some viruses, of course, the RNA viruses, the inherited changes are in the RNA. And next is natural selection, and that's when the environmental conditions, both outside of the organism and within the organism, including inside the cells, those mutations are subject to these natural selective processes in those environmental conditions. And so these are definitely non-random, and this is where a lot of the specificity comes with regard to evolution of organisms and cells and molecular processes. The third aspect of evolution is random genetic drift. And this is caused by mutations that have no selection on them, either positive or negative. So they're neutral as far as their effects on the organism. However, if the organism moves to a different environment, or if the environmental conditions change, then these genes that previously had no selection on them may be subject to natural selection. So you can have rapid evolutionary changes because of these environmental condition changes, either by moving or by just having the conditions change. So then you get the convergence of these three effects, the mutations, natural selection, and random genetic drift, which are the drivers of evolution of organisms. So in general, this is how evolution works. You have a parent over here, and then it gives rise to many different progeny. Each of the progeny have mutations, and then natural selection works either for or against those mutations, or in some cases they're neutral mutations, so they get through as well. And then later you have survivors of those that also reproduce, produce many variant organisms from there, and then some of those eventually go extinct up here, and then others survive to then undergo more mutation with their progeny, producing their progeny with mutations, more variation in characters, and on and on. So while this is sort of a simple process, it happens, millions and billions of times over rather short periods of time, and you can generate many variants, and then selection acts on those variants, eventually producing organisms that can survive in more and more varied environments as well. And so eventually we come out with something like this, and this is a phylogenetic tree, and on this side over here, these are all the bacteria, and then over here are the archaea and eukaryotes, which are closely related actually. And then the origin back here is at about 3.8 to 4.1 billion years ago. It keeps getting pushed back a little by little. So there was initially this separation between bacteria and archaea, and the bacteria diversified into Firmicutes, Chlamydia, etc., the proteobacteria over here, cyanobacteria there. And then these archaea further diverged into several different phyla of archaea, and then some of those became the eukaryotes, which picked up first a nucleus, then mitochondria, then plastids, and other organelles as well. And by other organelles, here's this eukaryotic line. What I mean is in this group here, The plants, first of all, picked up a plastid from which was originally a cyanobacterial endosymbiont. But then red algae, green algae became incorporated into this chromalveolate, or this alveolata, or now called the SAR group, for Stromatophiles, alveolata, and Riceria. And so that these eukaryotes over here, these photosynthetic eukaryotes, became the organelles within this group as well as others. And we'll talk about some of the complexities of that later. So the problem becomes very complex in a hurry. And so one of the ways that we can look is to look backwards. So about a century ago, Kierkegaard said life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So what I want to do is start with today, and then work backwards and try and put some of these complex concepts in some form that you can understand. So I call this section "Looking Backwards." So if we're way out here at the end here, as far as the age of the universe, and we go way back to the very beginning, it's been deduced that there was what's called the Big Bang, and the different people describe this or define this in different ways. But the origin of our universe happened about 13.8 billion years ago, which is a long time ago. So if we put some important dates on this, here we are today, 13.7 to 13.8 billion years ago. Then a little while ago, the solar system formed. Before that, about 1 billion years into the universe, the galaxies formed, and about 300 million years into the universe, the stars formed. About 300,000 years ago, the atoms formed, and then back here, just after the Big Bang, is something called the quark soup, where the quarks originated and eventually produced atoms and eventually molecules, and the stars formed, forming more elements and more molecules going forward to here, where we finally have biological systems that we can watch evolve over time. Just a note that this is not a linear scale, as you can see up here, because 3 billion happens here, and then 13.7 billion is way out here. But if we put this on a linear scale, this is a linear scale here. Here's today, 13.8 billion years after the beginning. And back here, about 9.5 billion years after the beginning, the first life on Earth occurred. And that was just shortly after, only a few 100 million years after the solar system had formed. And then you go back here, the first galaxy is about 1 billion years into the universe, about 300 million years, the first stars, 300,000 years, the first atoms, and about the first several milliseconds you get protons and neutrons, and just barely after the Big Bang you start getting this what's called the quark soup. You can kind of measure this out. If you have a tape measure, you can pace it out. Your pace is about 2 to 3 feet per step. And you can pace this out to 25 feet, or if your room is only 13 feet, you can also reduce the scale, and you can kind of look at when these things happened in relation to one another. So here's that time between about 9.5 billion years ago and 13.8 billion years ago. So this is the 4.5 billion years of existence of the Earth. And so you can see initially there was this chemical evolution, eventually producing the first ribozymes and biological molecules to form the first organisms around 3.8 to 4.1 or 4.2 billion years ago. And then the earliest evidence of true bacteria was about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. oxygenic photosynthesis here all the way forward to the dinosaurs and angiosperms way up here, and then we're way out here at the end on the very, a tiny little sliver right here at the end. So this is the Earth as it looks today. And it didn't always look like this, as you probably know. And in the very beginning, there were very few continents. There was only one tiny continent and a lot of ocean. And even before that, there was no ocean and just rock. So it changed quite a bit in the very early stages, within the first 1 or 200 million years. The Earth went from hot, molten, to cooler, but now filled with water, a lot of ocean around on the Earth as well. But this is the current look of the Earth, and so let's start here. Currently, about 1.7 to 1.8 million organisms, species have been described by scientists. But estimates are that there are actually about 12.5 to 13 million species existent on the Earth right now. And so the red bars here indicate the relative abundance of each one of those. You can see that insects dominate primarily. You also have a lot of plant species. And then these are the vertebrates here. We're within that tiny little group down there. Fungi and bacteria and viruses are sort of underrepresented. There probably are more of those yet to be described. Also realize that over the last 4 billion years, there have been many species that have gone extinct. So there are even more than this that have existed on Earth. So here's one species that you are familiar with. These are humans, Homo sapiens, and a lot of variation there, right? So there's a lot of variability within human populations, showing you that there are these mutations and different selective processes ongoing in the human species. And of course, we are multicellular, so that creates many cell types and many genes that have to control different types of cells, liver cells and lung cells and skin cells, etc. So just so that you can relate, here are the humans, and I want to show where those are in relation to other organisms. So here's a phylogenetic tree moving backwards from humans, and so we're way down here. A short branch on what are called the hominins, and so these are, the hominins are the human-like species down here. And we're also related to the hominids, which include the great apes as well. So you can see here's the genus Homo down here, consisting of Homo sapiens, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthalensis, Erectus, also Denisovians, and other ones that aren't on here. And then going up into these Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, these human-like ancestors as well. And finally up into chimpanzees and bonobos, from which branched off from the other hominids about 6 to 8 million years ago. Here's another view of that, a little broader view. So here's Homo sapiens up here, branching from Neanderthalensis, Heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, other Homo species, and then diverging about 6 to 8 million years ago from chimpanzees, gorillas, etc., the other hominids. And then further back are monkeys, tarsiers, and other primates as well. And this is shown a little further out over here on the right-hand side. The species Homo is over here with Pan, which are the chimpanzees and the bonobos. And then going back up through monkeys over here, you have tarsiers, lemurs, lorises, etc. And then this is rooted with mouse and rats, which are all mammals. And primates, of course, are members of Mammalia, the mammals, including cats and dogs and all sorts of different organisms, and including marsupial mammals, which split off from the placental mammals many millions of years ago also. So that brings us back to about 210 million years ago, when the first mammals appeared, and they had split off from the reptiles, including dinosaurs, which were around right about that time as well. And at that time, they were quite small and very inconspicuous. You probably wouldn't have even been able to see many of them back at that time. Small little things, sort of looked like mice or shrews, something similar to that. And of course, you have several different types of mammals. Here's where the hominins would fit right in this section of this phylogram here. The placental mammals, where most of the development of the young happens inside of a uterus inside the female. Marsupial mammals, where a lot of the development happens outside the female. And then things like the duckbill platypus and things like that, which are monotremes, are further back in evolution than those as well. As we go back in time, and there are more and more branches on these trees, then you see less and less detail, so that humans and monkeys are in here. You can barely see them in there. You have whales, cetaceans, there are zebras, antelope here, dogs and cats would be up here, etc. But if we look at the detail in each one of those branches, there's still quite a bit of variation. So, for example, if we just look at cats, Felis catus, which is one small branch on that previous tree, this has a lot of variation as well, going from, a Sphinx cat to a Norwegian forest cat, to a Siamese cat, and etc., Russian blue over here. A lot of variation just in that small branch of that larger phylogram. The same can be said for dogs, just in that one small branch of wolves and canids. Then Canis lupus, which is dog, domestic dog, you have a large amount of variation. And a lot of the variation came from, specialization caused by mating, humans mating the dogs and selecting for specific characters. And even within the genus Canis, so here's gray wolves, red wolves, domestic dog over here, dingoes, etc., coyotes down here. There's a lot of variation within each one of those species. And furthermore, they can cross-hybridize. That is, you can have breeding between the coyote and dogs, between gray wolf and dogs, and form reproductively capable offspring from each one of those. So also, in addition to the variation, there's a lot of hybridization or crossing within some of those branches of those phylograms. And now if you go further out, here are the mammals just summarized, but with the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentals. On that branch further out, you go to the amniota, and you have the reptiles over here, the turtles, crocodiles, lizards, and the dinosaurs would be on that branch as well. And then further back, you have amphibians, lobe-finned fish, ray-finned fish, cartilaginous fish, and jawless fish back here. So that's all of the vertebrates, or most of the vertebrates on this tree here. And so the root of this tree would be back beyond 400 to 500 million years ago. And note here also that birds came out of this grouping as well. So here's a little more detail of part of that tree, and with emphasis on the evolution of birds out of this reptilian line, which included dinosaurs. including Archaeopteryx, which then had feathers, gliding feathers primarily, and then eventually into modern birds that have not only gliding feathers, but they have flight feathers where they can take flight rather than just gliding from a high place. And if you look back here, you find other dinosaurs with feathers also, but the feathers were primarily for heat retention and for coloration, for attracting mates as well. So we know from some other evidence also that feathers, the evolution of feathers, predated modern birds by millions of years, by tens of millions of years. Also from other evidence, we know that a lot of the genes involved, that eventually became involved in feather development, predated dinosaurs and some reptiles as well. So they were around a long time before feathers eventually developed from those genes and combinations of genes. So if we go back a little further, though, so we go through mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and then these lobe-finned fishes, where these lobed fins that they have eventually developed into legs and feet and wings and things like that. But how did that happen? We only know some of that from fossil evidence. So here's a lobe-finned fish that is actually extinct, and you can see its fins have more of almost an arm or a foot, and then fingers from there rather than a fin as in the previous fish and lobe-finned fish. And eventually then you have these reptilian, like crocodile-like organisms with true feet where they can walk on land. And some of them actually just walked on the bottom of lakes and oceans. So you have this progression from ray-finned fish, which aren't shown here, and then these lobe-finned fish where you have more foot-like structures with some fins coming out, finally with more distinct appendages coming out with toes and then legs, and eventually legs and arms in some organisms, and legs and wings in some of the organisms, such as birds as well. More recently, these appendages and toes and fingers and wings and things like that have been related to the existence of particular types of genes. And these are genes that control where those appendages are put and when they're put on and how extensive they are in different characteristics. So starting about 530 million years ago, there's the set of what are called Hox genes, an ancestral chordate with 14 different ones. And if you go back further into non-vertebrates, invertebrate species, there are fewer and fewer of these, but you can see those build up, and we'll talk more specifically about that later in the semester. Then you have a doubling in the jawless fish. So now you have whole genome duplication. Now you have two copies of these, and now they start to specialize as to where they're turned on and what tissues they're turned on in. And then you have a further duplication of a genome, and then this becomes a portion where the chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish like sharks, branch off. So if you look at a fin of a shark, you have the fin going out from there, which is primarily skin and cartilaginous and tissue. And then the bones are cartilage within there. There are many, many bones in there, and that forms those appendages. If you go up to the ray-finned fish, they've had another duplication of the genome, so now they have 8 copies of those Hox genes, and you have fewer of the bones, still a fin out from that. Going up further into these lobe-finned fishes, they start to increase specific versions of those Hox genes, specifically Hox13. And this causes a reduction in the number of bones in those fins. And you can see versions of those genes that have changed in their expression to make those body types, essentially, of those organisms. So now we're getting a fish, instead of having true fins swimming in the water, to having these lobe fins, and they can both propel themselves through the water, but they can also start to walk on the bottom of the lakes and oceans. Next, you have further increases in the expression of those Hox genes, and now starting to get these reptilian organisms that are able to walk not only on the bottom of the ocean bed and lake bed, but they can walk on land. And they have fewer of those toes on their appendages. Crocodiles have a similar look to their bone structure. So you can think of these as something like a crocodile crawling on both in the water and up on land as well. And then further increase in those Hox genes reduces the number of fingers and toes and lengthens the bones too. And it's not only the Hox genes, there are some other genes involved too. And including in birds and dinosaurs, you have even fewer toes. Usually it's 3 or 4 in different dinosaurs and birds. So they'll have 3 toes and 3 fingers in their wings as well in the case of birds. So now if we go back even further and have a tree that includes more than just the vertebrates. So the vertebrates would be over here. So that's a tiny little group within all of the animals. And then here are the insects up here, and arachnids over here, nematodes, anemones down here. And then finally these choanoflagellates, which are the single-celled animals. And those branch off from fungi. So we're going back hundreds of millions of years now, and then amoebozoa, and then finally other organisms down here, going back further in time. So now we can go back even further in these animals, back to about 610 million years ago. You can find sponges and jellyfish and anemones and things like that, dating back to those periods all the way to the present. Echinoderms, that is starfish, nematodes, mollusks, you can find to about 550 million years ago. And then if you go further forward, Chordata, our group, the very initial members of that group appeared about 500 million years ago. So far, then, we're about to hear in the evolution of the Earth, right? So about 500 to 600 million years before the present. So just to relate this to the age of the universe there, starting from the Big Bang, we're right about here so far, going from the present back about 600 million years ago. So we can go back further. Here's the animals. This branched off again about 500 or 600 million years ago, and then going back here to the root, which is about 4 billion years ago, and then into bacteria, which appeared around 3.8 billion years ago. Archaea occurred or appeared about 3 billion years ago, and then into these other eukaryotes here, the Excavata, Hacrobia, this SAR groups, Terminopiles, Alveolata, Rhizaria, Archaeplastida, the plants, and the amoebozoans here. Those all appeared within the last 2.5 billion years before the present. On this diagram also, anything in dark colors, and these are the more recent organisms that have evolved, are multicellular. And all of the white areas in here include only unicellular organisms. So there are some bacteria that are multicellular, some archaea, but mostly these are represented by unicellular species. But as you get up to plants, amoebae, fungi, animals, you have more and more representatives are multicellular. And so far I've talked mainly about the multicellular organisms. So as we work our way back from the present to about 1 to 2 billion years ago, a lot of the organisms have been multicellular, but there's still a lot of unicellular organisms out there also. In fact, probably more than the multicellular organisms. So multicellularity arose in many different groups, starting about 1 to 2 billion years ago, and that includes some bacteria become multicellular, some other organisms, including plants, Rhizaria, Stramenopiles, animals, amoeba, etc. Most of those have developed many different species of multicellular organisms. And this has been demonstrated by many different plant species. So this is just looking at the evolution of multicellularity in plants, starting with Chlamydomonas, which has just single unicellular cells that get together to form a zygote, but in general they are unicellular for most of their life cycle. And then Gonium, which gets together in sort of a slimy mass to form a loosely multicellular organism, and then working all the way up to Volvox here, where not only do you have a multicellular organism, but the cells then have started to specialize. Some specialize in movement of that entire organism, some specialize in photosynthesis, and others specialize in reproduction. So already there's a differentiation of different cell types, and that all takes different genes to actually form each one of those different cell types. Then if you go further within this plant line, here are the unicellular organisms in a light color here, and then multicellular organisms here. So you can see that this whole branch, all of these plants become more and more multicellular, and many different cell types specializing in different functions. And that all takes a lot of coordination in expression of many different gene types, including genes that control other types of genes to form different appendages, different types of cells, etc. So here you can see a phylogram here, which starts about 1.9 billion years ago with red algae down here at the bottom, where you start to get cells that have gained a cyanobacterial endosymbiont that becomes a chloroplast. Some of those about 1.5 billion years ago become multicellular, and then about 1.2 billion years ago green algae appear, including multicellular green algae. And then evolution of the mosses about 470 million years ago. Now these are non-vascular, but they still have their major cell type are haploids, and then they form diploids that form reproductive structures. And then into the ferns, which are now vascular plants, which can be larger and larger. In fact, some seed ferns were 20 and 30 feet tall 300 to 400 million years ago. And then into gymnosperms, which at first were, 10, 20, 30 feet tall. Again, vascular plants that could reach higher in the canopy to get more and more of the sunlight for photosynthesis. However, to get larger and larger, they also had more cell types and more supportive tissue to gain altitude, essentially, to compete for sunlight. And then about 150 million years ago, start to get angiosperms, including the magnoliids, which were some of the first ones, and then monocots and dicots, eudicots, evolved about 120 million years ago. And now we have many, many different species of dicots and monocots. Each one of the circles on these phylograms indicate some documented events, which are whole genome duplication. So within plants, you've got a lot of cases of genome duplication. So the whole genome, in this case, is duplicated in these. So then you have more and more genes, and then you can have more and more evolution of those gene copies within those plants. And that's led to a lot of the variation and a lot of the evolution in plants. Similar processes have happened in animals also, which I indicated previously on a previous slide with regard to the Hox genes. So as with animals, then plants, especially flowering plants, have become very diverse. A lot of different flower types have evolved to be either wind pollinated or water pollinated or insect pollinated or bird pollinated, etc., or man pollinated now. So, and that's all due to coordination of these genes that control other genes that form each one of those different types of cell types, and then in concert produce those very complex structures on the plants as well as in the animals. And that includes humans too. So that includes the fact that you have 5 fingers, 5 toes, 2 legs, 2 arms, things like that, 2 eyes. Those are all the result of high coordination of both controlling genes that are controlling other genes, as well as relative amounts of those genes turning on and off in the different cell types. Now, sometimes those go wrong, and then you get a tumor or a cancer, and those can occur in any multicellular organism, in animals as well as in plants. Okay, so that's the end of this first video, sort of looking backward, starting from humans, going into primates, into mammals, and then back further into other organisms, the protists, and then eventually the bacteria and archaea. Sort of trying to get you to conceptualize these changes and how many changes have occurred over the past about 4 billion years of evolution of life on Earth. So that's it for today, but in the next video I'll be going into more details about evolution of life on Earth before we start talking in detail about some of the molecules. Okay, see you in the next video.